Great. So thank you all so much for joining today. First things first, if you just want to put your name and affiliation in the chat, I definitely want us to get to know each other a bit, but we're going to have breakout rooms later and have a little bit more time for discussion together. But I didn't want to take up too much time in the introductions. Um, so we're going to start first with that, and then we will have a few different, just pretty brief presentations to give you an overview and orientation to the project. I'm going to talk about the overall, what is it, the goals, the deliverables, the timeline. I'll hand it over to Emily, who will talk about our different plans that we're looking into and creating our inventory and a Miro board, which is a pretty cool tool that we'll share with you. And then I'll hand it to Jonas and Nick from the Horsley Witten group to talk about the status of our fieldwork modeling and next steps. So we'll have some time after that for just sort of general Q&A, and then we'll have some facilitated conversation around our approach to this work and our engagement. We'll give you kind of an overview of what we're planning in terms of engagement and outreach in the spring. And then we'll have breakout groups. So I know that everyone will be like, I don't feel like I know enough about this yet. So we will break out into, if we stay around this number, probably just two groups. And we'll have time for more in-depth conversations around different topic areas, and talk about, what do you think so far? What are we missing? What do we need to include? Who should we share this with? How can this project be informed by and inform other projects? And what else is happening that we should be aware of? We'll probably spend about 45 minutes in those breakout groups, so it should be a good chunk of time for discussion. And then we're going to come back together. We'll report out and then go over a wrap up. I know a couple folks emailed me saying that they have to leave early, so I just want to put it out there that oh no, this is a terrible typo. Wednesday, June 10th, not Wednesday, June 6th. I don't know how that got there. I think I put 6:10 at one point. Don't look at that. Wednesday, June 10th was the plan for our next steering committee meeting, but we'll have a question at the end for you also of how do you want us to engage with you moving forward? And do we want to make smaller breakout groups that meet separately, or do you want to just follow us up individually, etc.? So I've given you no context yet. So let's go into context. I'm Stephanie Cavino. I'm the executive director of the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative. I probably know all of you. Thank you so much again for coming. Thank you for putting all your information in the chat. Like I said, I'll go first and I'll hand it to Emily and then Jonas. So what we're talking about today is this NIFWIF funded project, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, via the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. We got this $1.1 million award, which is huge for us. We're, as you probably know, a really small three-person nonprofit, recently three people. We were two for quite a while. And this is like a life-changing grant for us. So our plan is to create this sort of comprehensive vision plan for the river. And we want it to be pretty comprehensive in a lot of different topic areas. So what we are starting with as a baseline for everything is reviewing our historic and existing plans. We know that a lot of you and others have put in decades of work into this watershed and have already identified a lot of priority projects and what we need to build from. So we want to work from there and build on top of and not duplicate efforts. So we're really well aware of that. We're doing a lot of field work in a lot of different ways. We've been on the river a lot in the past year. We will continue to do so in these coming years. And community engagement is critical to everything we do. So this project is a partnership between all the different groups you can see here on the right, as well as many, many others that are not necessarily funded project partners, but absolutely will be critical to gathering all of this information. So as we go through each of these three different things, we're breaking them out into basically three different categories, depending on how you define it. So one is we really wanted to better understand the river and the canal together and the hydrology behind it. This was really inspired a few years ago when we paddled the river in 2022 and we were dragging our boats for miles at times. We were like, why? I know we're in a drought, but how does the river literally dead end? This seems pretty crazy. What's happening hydrologically speaking? We didn't know the answer to that. So we wanted to commission an H&H to understand the hydrology of the river better and specifically identify opportunities for restoration in both flood and drought conditions. So that's the sort of technical H&H piece. And if you're really interested in this piece, when we go to breakout rooms, Jonas and Nick will be leading one of those breakout rooms. You want to go into their room because they're going to be able to answer your questions. The second piece is around dams. We know, depending on who you ask, there's somewhere between like 19 and 22 dams on the Blackstone River's main stem. But we wanted to make a really detailed inventory of how tall are they? What were they originally used for? Are they still in current use? Can you see them from the road? What is the potential of removing this dam? What do we know about it so far in terms of sediment or previous owner interaction of being interested in removal, et cetera? And then we want to be able to prioritize some of those projects to pursue specifically one dam removal. We can't do implementation under this grant, but we do want to know what's sort of our potential top priority. So detailed inventory of dams and exploration of a few different specific dams. And Emily will talk more about that. If you're really interested in dams, you want to go into Emily's room when we do breakouts. And then access. Access is critical for everything else. We want to create stewards for this river. We want people to get to the river and see it and see how beautiful it is and how much of a recreational and natural resource it is. So we have been, you probably know, we've been working on an inventory of different access points, but we want to be able to also identify all of the gaps there and start designing new access points. We're already well on our way for this. We've taken community members and local planners out in the river, and they've said, oh, yeah, this sounds great. Let's make a new access point here. And we're like, awesome. We are in like year one. This is not on our plan yet, but let's start pursuing this. So we're really interested in designing new equitable access points to strengthen the community's connection to the river. So we have these sort of three topic areas. As you sort of sprinkle in, we're also really interested in public art opportunities. It's another great way to have people see and turn to the river. But we're creating this H&H, this dam action plan, and this access action plan. Altogether, that will be into this one big, really pretty, visually appealing kittacuck restored or Mish kittacuck sepe restored vision plan. So as you have probably heard, Mish kittacuck sepe is the Narragansett word for the Blackstone, and kittacuck is the Nipmuc word for the Blackstone, both meaning Great Tidal River. So this vision plan will identify our priority projects in each of those different topic areas. It will help us strengthen partnerships between all of the different groups within the Blackstone watershed and outside of it. We want to be able to identify funding opportunities, next steps, permitting requirements, who are the partners involved, really have these sort of one-pagers for each of these maybe top like 5 projects in each of these categories. And as I mentioned, also consider public art and placemaking opportunities throughout this project. So it's a lot, but I wanted to give you a quick breakdown of our timeline. So right now we've done this, we're working on our H&H. We'll finish that mostly in 2025. We've done this lit review, baseline outreach, identifying some priority projects, and we have the steering committee meeting. 2026 is a bit of a bull. Our team's a little scared of this, but this is what we are in for. So we are going to be working to finish everything hydrologically in the spring of 2026. We're going to finish our field work for the dam inventory. We're working with both the Hassanamisko Nipmuc Band and the Narragansett Indian Tribe to create a tribal cultural inventory and incorporate that into our work. We're going to be doing GIS mapping. We're working with REC to do youth-led engagement in Worcester. We're having a ton of community outreach and like fun pop-up events in the spring, which I'll talk about a little bit later. We're proposing that we meet again in June. And after that, we'll have this pretty solid draft of the dam access and overall action plans. In 2027, we'll be wrapping up all of our deliverables and doing a lot more outreach around what we have sort of found so far, and then everything will be finalized hopefully by the end of 2027. So as I mentioned, we've done a lot so far. So last year we had our annual spring migration parade, which we paddled, which was really fun. We brought people to where we want to restore migratory fish to in Lonsdale Marsh. We did a source to sea paddle or a Blackstone expedition paddle, and we did a lot of river exploration field work. We brought out community staff and municipal staff onto the river and found out a lot about what they know and don't know so far about the river as well. And we reviewed all of those municipal and regional plans. It was over 50 documents. We had a really wonderful intern, Mallory McPherson, that went through, and I'll show you in a minute what she found with all of those. But again, working from what we know so far. We've done a lot of community meetings and worked with all the main STEM communities to sort of present what we found, clarify new projects. We found a lot more through this as well. Community members and town staff really know, they know their communities and what's going on. We met on October 20th for our monthly collaborative meeting in person. We presented what we had so far and went through refining different priority projects. We consolidated this all into this really cool Nero board, which I'll let Emily talk about in a minute. And then also in the background, Horsley Witten's doing all of this work on H&H. So they're drafting their technical report and memo and completing all of their field work. We wanted to mention also that we are aware that there are other projects going on. These are just a couple that really complement our project well. So one is the Blackstone Heritage Corridors Legacy Campaign. They are doing an inventory of all of the signage throughout the river and then hopefully creating this comprehensive plan of how can we do wayfinding and signage and placemaking throughout the watershed together. They're also working on the bikeway, which is a critical way to get people to see and be stewards for this watershed in the river. We're also working with CMRPC, our regional planning agency, and Horsley Witten on a 604B project, so a watershed-based plan for the Massachusetts portion of the river. So when this is done in the next 2 years-ish, I'm going to blank on that one, we'll have all of our Massachusetts communities be eligible for 319 implementation funding. So this is more on water quality. So this project isn't so water quality focused, but we are working on that just with a different funding source. And a note that we're not ignoring Rhode Island through the SNAP network. We are working with the UNH Stormwater Center to look at hydrologic response units, HRU mapping, and identifying opportunities to improve water quality in Rhode Island as well. So that was a lot, but generally, if you look on our website, you'll probably find what you're looking for. If you have questions, please, let us know. We'll take all of the questions at the end of the presentations, but if there's more that you want to see on our website, shoot us a message. And these are just some of the things that are on there. It's a link to this is Mallory's work on each of the different municipal plans, a description, recommendations, the category for those recommendations, their priority, and then quick summary from that municipality. She also put this into this sort of 2-page summary report, and you have a link on our website to the Miro board, which is super cool. So with that, I will stop sharing and I will hand it to Emily.
Thanks, Steph. I'll actually jump back into the same presentation. Let's see. Hold on just a second. Where am I? There we go. Slideshow. Oops. Hold on. Let's see. There we go. Great. Can you all see my screen now? Okay, excellent. Hello, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Emily Vogler. I'm a landscape architect and environmental planner. I have a practice, commonplace landscape and planning, and I also teach landscape architecture at RISD. I've been collaborating with Steph and many other people on the Blackstone River now for seems like maybe 5 or more years, and so it's great to be here and be able to collaborate on this project in terms of thinking about how we move a lot of this work forward. And so I'm just going to provide a bit of an overview of what we've been working on, and then we'll be getting into a bit more of the kind of nitty-gritty of getting really what main goal for today is, which is to get your all's feedback on some of this work. And so one of the big things that we've been working on is early on here is just like this question of like, how do we begin to visualize the Blackstone River in its entirety and also begin to be able to think at that large kind of river scale, but then be able to come down to site-specific projects that we could be able to move forward with. And so the first part of that is just like thinking about like, how do we visualize the river in order to help both ourselves in this process, but also to help the general public begin to really imagine the river itself as its own, kind of as the beautiful Blackstone River in its entirety, and also kind of rebuild people's kind of connection to that. And so one of the things, Steph's been showing this image And one of the things that we've been working on is just these ways that we could begin to visualize to understand the river as an interconnected system. So this is just one of the kind of early drawings that we've been working on that just tries to really communicate all the different communities that the river goes through. Along with this, we've also been thinking of like, how do we begin to map the river in order to be able to then zoom in and work on these different segments. And so one part of that is just developing a series of these base maps that we can use as we move forward with the more kind of segment specific and then ultimately the more site specific projects. And this has been really key for us in terms of just wrapping our head around how do we work at a river scale. But also I think going to be really important as we move forward into the next stages of, kind of both bringing this material out to communities. I think some of you probably engaged with some of these maps already at the Blackstone Collaborative meeting a couple of months ago. And in addition, we also have the big map or the big model of the river, which some of you might have seen. I don't have a photo of it here, but it is a model of the entirety of the Blackstone River. And so we're just trying to think through like how do we just begin to take this on, like I said, as at a river scale, and then where and how do we start to help us be able to orient the different projects that we might be pursuing, and then as we think through the prioritization. One of the main things that we've been working on is to compile, like we're working towards, right, this kind of inventorying and prioritizing of, both access points, dams, as well as restoration parcels or restoration opportunities. And one of the things we're trying to do, like Steph mentioned, is to bring forward a lot of the work that has happened before in all of the previous planning efforts, all the work that a lot of you have been involved in, but now be able to map that out and be able to identify which are the ones that we want to move forward with. This is a tool that we use called Miro, which some of you may have interacted with. We did send it out after the last collaborative meeting, but essentially we're going during the breakout group that we'll be organizing, we'll be using this in order to go through some of the projects that we've identified from the different plans and from the last collaborative meeting in order to walk people through and get feedback on some of these different projects that have been emerging during these conversations. One thing to note is that for the sake of mapping this, we have divided things up into access, dam, maintenance, and restoration types of projects. But really, we're looking for where there might be also co-benefits, where there might be an opportunity to think about here's a site that could benefit from restoration. That's a dam that could potentially be removed. How can we begin to think about where and how we could introduce public access as well as think about the restoration of that area? And so, we're pulling them apart in some ways, but a lot of these, I was like, should that be red? Should that be purple? I don't know. There's kind of all of the above. And so just kind of putting that out there. And this will be a tool that we will use during today's call, but that will continue forward as, as we continue progressing on this project. We'll also share a link after this so that everybody could jump in and use this. And then also we've just been working on kind of some of the kind of dam action plan, in conjunction with Horsley Witten. We've all been having conversations about which dams are kind of rising to the top in terms of which might be priorities for considering, the future of. And we're building off of some of the work that we did with the Dam Atlas in order to think about how do we just begin to map all of the dams within the Blackstone watershed, but really we're focusing in on prioritizing on the main stems for this project. And so we're both, but we want to understand it within that larger watershed context. And so we've been going in and doing a deep dive on a lot of the individual dams on the main stem, starting to compile and write up, kind of research some of those histories, think through what some of the different opportunities and constraints might be for each of the dams, looking back at, historical images, historical maps, current conditions through photographs we've taken from being on the river, as well as any current plans that there might be for discussions of the future of these projects. And so the goal will be that in this final document, all of that information will be compiled. So we will have the kind of final vision plan, which will have, all aspects of what it is that we've been talking about today, right? So it'll talk more generally about the river. It'll talk about the dams, it'll talk about access, it'll talk about restoration, and it'll have it all consolidated in order to be a kind of clear vision for the collaborative and for other people working on the river as they move forward. And so we're just starting to kind of pull together those different parts, but really excited to have you all here. And like Steph said, welcome as much involvement as you all are want to have, right, in this project and in this process. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to Jonas. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Emily. I will try to start sharing.
And
Awesome.
just one quick thing while Jonas gets his slides up, I'm going to share the Miro link in the chat, and so people can use that Miro link for during the call later on. So just to plug that.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. So hi everyone. I'm Jonas Procton. I'm a water resources engineer at Horsley Witten Group. And I'm joined by my colleague Nick Cohen, who's an environmental planner. And together, along with some other members of our team, we've been working on the H&H modeling piece of this entire project. So we just wanted to share a bit of what that all entails, and give you a look into what we've done so far and where we're going to keep going into 2026. So before we get too deep into, all the project pieces, um, I thought it'd just be helpful to talk about like what an H&H model is. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard this term. Some of you might be familiar, and some of you might say like, What are we actually talking about here?" So to try to like scienceify, unengineerify it as much as possible. We're talking about hydrology and hydraulics. And so what that actually means, when we talk about hydrology, we're talking about just the water that is entering the system of the river. So the water that comes mostly as rainfall, sometimes as snow, but basically precipitation that falls into the watershed, and either as runoff directly entering the river, or maybe entering into the earth, soaking up and coming into the river through groundwater. It's getting to the river and it becomes flow. So we're thinking about rainfall again. We're thinking about what the watershed looks like, if it has a lot of paved surfaces, or if it's really natural and forested, if it's really steep, and also geology kind of factor into the hydrology piece of the model. And then when we're talking about hydraulics, we're actually thinking about how that flow, how all that water comes into the river and interacts with the shape of the river. So that means how narrow or wide the river is, how deep it is, but it also means how it interacts with things that people have built along the river. So things like dams, bridges that either maybe they pinch the river, or maybe they're so wide that the river doesn't really notice them unless it's flooding, um, and other sort of built infrastructure like canals, which might move flow from one part of the river to another part, or maybe even out of the system. And that in the model, we are able to look at how the hydrology and the hydraulics interact, and that tells us things like um, the water elevation, how deep it is, how fast it's moving, how much power it has, and that helps us understand what would happen as we look at different restoration scenarios. So in terms of the overall project, we don't just start with modeling, we start looking at all the data that has been gathered so far. So a lot of that came from the research that Mallory looked into, and all the past work that's been done thinking of different possible restoration sites, all the information that Emily's team has put together on looking at each of the dams along the river. And then some additional research we've looked into about all the bridges and culverts that run along the river, over 70 different bridges, and then all the different pieces of the canal that are still intact and maybe interact with the river, um, diverting water from it, re-entering at some point. So we look at that, and we're in the process of putting together a memo just summarizing all of the background data we've looked at, for the main stem of the Blackstone. Um, and I say main stem just because we're focusing on the main stem for this project, um, based on, how much funding is available for this project. We inherently have to kind of limit our scope to one area for now. So we're starting with the main stem with the ability to add on different pieces in the watershed, different tributaries later on. So once we wrap up this data review, and really as we've been going, we've been able to do some of the field work that will then inform our restoration analysis. So um, our scope includes survey and design at 10 different sites. So far we've been to 8 of those sites, and we'll, go to all those sites, summarize that in a memo too. Um, and we have also been working on some stakeholder engagement, just like, you know, this meeting now, getting to share our information with you. And that will continue as we learn more and more about the river and the different restoration scenarios we look at. And then coming in the new year, we'll focus a lot more on the actual modeling piece. So taking what we've been doing in our field work and doing looking at all sorts of different restoration scenarios at the 10 sites that we have selected. And so you might be asking, what sort of sites are we picking? How do they pick those sites? So we are looking at dam removals, sort of like Emily was talking about, looking at spots where we have some overlap between the dams and potential restoration opportunities. We're also looking at places where we can restore the natural hydrology of the river. So this is getting at places where maybe flow is entering the or is exiting the main river and it's actually entering the canal. And in dry times, the river might even be running dry because the flow is being siphoned off into the canal. So how can we restore the natural hydrology of the river, keep the water in the river itself rather than the canal? And then we're also looking at bridges that are severe constrictions, so sort of pinch points that might be causing flooding or other, you know, negative impacts. So far we've been prioritizing these sites based on conversations with the Blackstone Collaborative. We've talked a lot with Steph and her team and Emily and Emily's team and also just the larger collaborative group to get some input on which sites would be the best ones to start with. So that's part of why we have 8 sites so far, and we still have 2 that we can receive some input on before we select them. But here's an overview of what we've been looking at so far. So just going from upstream to downstream, we started up at the Blackstone Heritage Center, the Quinsigamond Village dams. Um, Going downstream, the Millbury Electric Dam, that's number 2. Number 3, Wilkinsonville Dam, Saundersville Dam, Farnhamsville, and then, so that's all dams so far, 1 through 5. Number 6 is a location where the canal and the river, the levee separating the two, has actually breached near Plummer's Landing. And so that's one of those locations where flow is leaving the river and it's entering the canal. And so that's a potential site where we could um, repair that breach and keep flow in the river. And then moving downstream a little farther, the Saranac Dam, also called the Blackstone Dam in sort of downtown Blackstone, Mass. And finally, looking at the Pratt Dam and sort of reconfiguring the tubes, if anyone's familiar with that sort of bridge section of the structure um, farther down Rhode Island. So like I said, we're still waiting to figure out what our last 2 sites are. We're talking more with the collaborative. We're also looking for input from this committee. If anyone has any, like, oh my gosh, you've got to look at this one. That is really helpful to us before we um, lock in our last 2 sites. And so some that come to mind for us that we've already noticed are undersized bridges, again, some pinch points that might be causing flooding, or just even some small rubble piles in the river. We've found some places that are probably legacy dams, used to be dams, but they've kind of um, breached and fallen into the river on their own, so they're not major blocking points if you're paddling or if you're a fish trying to get along the river, but they still have some sort of impact either on making some sort of ripple or whitewater. Um, And then next steps. So other than getting some input, I'll talk a little bit more about what the model itself entails. So like I said, we've been out in the field, we've been surveying these sites. Um, we have the existing FEMA model of the Blackstone River, and that's sort of our starting point. That's the bones of what we work off of. But then we add more detail from getting into these sites, and like you can see in this picture, we're surveying them just like you see people on the road with their tripod and their survey rod. We're doing that in the river, and we're getting more detailed information so that we can really inform um, our approach as we develop restoration scenarios. So really conceptual still at this point, but we want to analyze, say it's a dam and we're interested in removing um, some of it, all of it. We want to understand how that changed in the structure of the river, the shape of it, how that changes things like the water levels, the depths, all the things we talked about before. So we'll look at all these different scenarios and we'll figure out what the benefits of removal are. Um, how feasible is it? Is it a small dam, a small bridge, a big bridge? How much level of effort goes into that restoration scenario? And then we'll use that to evaluate their different success rates or likelihood of success, I should say, as we think about next steps. And of course, we'll bring it back to you all and we'll hear from you and get your thoughts as we have a little more information on the different scenarios. That's all I have. Steph, I don't know if you want to save questions for when we do breakout groups or if I have any time right now that I can answer anything. But that is
So
it.
the next thing on our agenda is questions.